They said it couldn't be done, that no one could stand up to the rules. The fines, the endless inspections that controlled every inch of our neighborhood. I thought they were exaggerating, until the day Karen showed up at my driveway with that smug look, her Tesla parked like a crown, daring me to move it. Not with a tow, not with a mechanic, with whatever I had and whatever she thought I couldn't. The HOA had already made it clear small violations weren't just small. A crooked fence, a misaligned mailbox, even a few weeds over the limit could cost hundreds, even thousands. They thrived on fear, on control, on neighbors watching neighbors like predators circling. But this wasn't about weeds or fences. This was about one woman's ego, her need to prove she could dictate reality. And somehow, she thought I wouldn't fight back. So when she laughed and left, thinking I would give in, I started planning. Every absurd, impossible, insane step of it. The neighbors whispered. The HOA fumed, and the Tesla sat there, untouchable, or so everyone believed. Could one person really take on a neighborhood army armed with rules, power, and arrogance, and turn it into chaos? Or was I about to make a mistake that would haunt me forever? Before the chaos began, life in our little corner of the world seemed perfect. The sun slanted gently across the manicured lawns each morning, and the streets smelled faintly of fresh cut grass and jasmine. Children biked along the sidewalks, waving to neighbors who smiled back as if nothing could ever go wrong here. That was the illusion, anyway. I had moved in thinking I'd found a safe, welcoming neighborhood, a place where weekends were spent tinkering in the garage or hosting barbecues with friends. My home, a modest but tidy house with a cherry red Tesla in the driveway, represented years of hard work and late nights. My family and I had finally reached the point where life felt comfortable, where the world's chaos seemed to exist just beyond our perfectly trimmed hedges. Of course, communities have rules. Some are reasonable: trash days, quiet hours, lawn maintenance. But ours had a way of stretching rules into instruments of control. Small things became major offenses, enforced with letters that piled up faster than the morning mail. At first, I thought it was just bureaucracy, tedious, maybe, but nothing personal. Then I met Karen. Karen was a resident whose reputation traveled ahead of her, meticulous, demanding, and relentless. She had an eye for any deviation from the HOA's so-called standards. And she made it her mission to ensure everyone else noticed as well. From the way she polished her front porch to the exact placement of her Tesla in the driveway, Karen projected perfection, and she expected everyone else to mirror it. Her smiles were rare, but when they came, they felt like a warning. It started subtly. A note on my mailbox: please ensure your hedges do not exceed 3 feet. HOA will inspect weekly. A casual suggestion that somehow carried the weight of judgment. A friendly warning: that garden gnome might be considered non-compliant. At the time, I laughed it off. Who cared about gnomes? But in hindsight, these little nudges were the prelude to something bigger. A tension that would grow until the day Karen dared me to move her Tesla. Our neighborhood, like many others, thrived on appearances. Behind every cheerful wave of painted siding, there was a web of scrutiny and expectations. People whispered about fines, about letters from the OA that seemed to appear out of nowhere, about neighbors who disappeared for weeks after challenging a rule. I had assumed those were exaggerations, stories to entertain dinner guests. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to notice the patterns. Even my own yard started to feel like a battlefield. The hedge along the side of my house, once a source of pride, now became a source of anxiety. Every time I trimmed it, I wondered if it was too much or not enough. My driveway, normally a place of convenience, felt like a stage under constant observation. Every vehicle I parked, every object I left outside, felt like a silent test I was bound to fail. And all the while, Karen was watching. Yet life had its rhythms. Mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings of quiet reflection. Occasional laughter shared with neighbors who hadn't yet succumbed to the neighborhood's subtle tyranny. My family and I still believed in fairness, in community, in the idea that most people wanted the same things: peace, pride in their homes, and freedom to live without intrusion. Little did we know that the coming weeks would test every assumption we had, twisting ordinary rules into absurd demands, pitting neighbor against neighbor, and turning the driveway of a simple Tesla into the stage for a neighborhood spectacle no one would forget. It all started with a dare, a challenge so ridiculous it felt impossible. Karen, confident and unyielding, believed I would back down, but I couldn't. Not this time. Not when the petty rules and incessant control had already stolen too many mornings, too many weekends, too many moments of peace. The battle lines were drawn, and though I didn't yet know how, I sensed that the confrontation ahead would change everything about life in our quiet little street. After the initial dare, the tension in the neighborhood shifted like the air before a storm. At first, it was subtle. The occasional glances from neighbors, the whisper of a comment when I walked past, the faint rustle of papers slipping under my door. But soon the subtleties became impossible to ignore. The HOA wasn't just watching, they were orchestrating a campaign of control. Each letter and notice a calculated move designed to test my patience, my sanity, and my resolve. It started with my mailbox. A small infraction. According to them, my house numbers were slightly askew, not perfectly centered according to the HOA's specifications. I laughed when I first saw the letter, assuming it was a minor correction. By the next morning, however, the tone had shifted. The letter now cited a fine, retroactive and mounting, with a warning that continued noncompliance would escalate to legal action. It felt absurd. House numbers. But I realized quickly that in this neighborhood, absurdity was the rule, not the exception. Karen watched all of this with an unspoken satisfaction. She didn't need to say anything. Her smirks, the subtle flick of her head when passing by, conveyed enough. I could almost hear the words, "You can't fight me. You won't fight back." It was clear that the Tesla in her driveway wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of dominance, a reminder of the hierarchy the HOA and her meticulously cultivated ego enforced. The next escalation came fast. One morning, I returned home to find a notice stapled to my front door. My hedge exceeded the HOA's permissible height. According to the latest interpretation of a rule written decades ago, I had pruned it carefully last week, measuring it against the HA's official guidelines. Yet here I was, once again facing fines. I spent hours measuring, trimming, and re-trimming, only to receive a call from the HOA representative, their voice dripping with impatience. "It's still not acceptable. We'll be sending an inspector tomorrow." The inspector's visit was a performance of intimidation. She paced along my property with a notebook, muttering to herself, occasionally stopping to take photos of what I considered perfectly normal landscaping. Each click of the camera felt like a strike, a mark of failure. The absurdity was almost comical if it weren't so infuriating. By the time she left, I felt simultaneously violated and enraged. The neighborhood was no longer a sanctuary, it was a stage for surveillance, and I was the unwilling actor. Then came the letters, pages stapled together, overflowing with citations, warnings, and fines. They claimed my driveway had oil stains that violated the HOA's aesthetics clause, my garage door needed repainting within 2 weeks, and my lawn ornaments, small, whimsical figures that had been there for years, were classified as non-conforming objects. Each letter carried an undercurrent of threat, a promise that continued defiance would result in legal action. The sheer volume of these communications was designed to exhaust me, to make me question my own judgment and sanity. Meanwhile, Karen continued her quiet campaign. She started hosting gatherings on her driveway, bringing neighbors over to inspect our properties. They would linger, chatting politely at first, then pointing out minor infractions as if they were natural conversation. The Tesla gleamed under the sunlight, parked like a trophy in the center of it all, a constant reminder of the imbalance of power. My mailbox, my hedge, my driveway, all became symbols of defiance and rebellion in her eyes, and apparently in the eyes of those she could influence. The tipping point came on a Friday morning when I received an official notice a fine had been imposed for an alleged violation I didn't even know existed. The citation was vague, citing inappropriate visual impact from my property, and it was accompanied by a threat of legal proceedings if payment wasn't made immediately. I stared at the letter, incredulous. How could the aesthetics of my home justify legal action? And more importantly, why did the HOA and Karen feel entitled to wield that power over me? Frustration gave way to determination. I realized that if I didn't push back, this would never end. Each fine, each letter, each whispered complaint from a neighbor would escalate, and the neighborhood would continue to be a prison of surveillance and control. My mind raced, formulating strategies to reclaim a sense of agency. Small victories weren't enough anymore. I needed a way to confront the absurdity head-on, to challenge the unspoken hierarchy that had turned our streets into a theater of dominance. Every day brought a new affront. I found yellow warning slips tucked under my windshield wipers, detailing improper parking angles or unauthorized outdoor objects. Even minor gardening choices were scrutinized and criticized. The cumulative effect was suffocating. Yet the tension also sharpened my resolve. I began documenting every encounter, photographing every citation, recording dates and times. I wasn't just fighting for my driveway or my hedge anymore. I was fighting for principle, for sanity, and for the right to exist without arbitrary oversight. The neighbors sensed the tension, and whispers grew louder. Some offered sympathetic smiles, carefully hidden as they passed, while others seemed eager to watch the inevitable clash. Every glance felt loaded, every casual comment a potential warning or threat. The street became a chessboard, and Karen, with her gleaming Tesla as her queen, seemed several moves ahead. But I was learning her patterns, understanding her strategy, and beginning to prepare a counter move that would shock everyone, though I couldn't yet know exactly how or when the moment would come. Then, the final straw, a meeting of the HOA board that I had reluctantly attended. It was meant to be a routine discussion, but Karen had orchestrated it into a spectacle. She presented my alleged infractions with precision, each violation punctuated by pointed looks and murmurs of agreement from other members. By the time it was over, I felt publicly humiliated, my home's reputation tarnished in front of the people who lived beside me. The room had been a battlefield, and I was on the losing side. But it lit a fire in me. Something had to give. I couldn't continue absorbing fines, enduring scrutiny, and submitting to arbitrary authority. Every petty rule, every invasive letter, every scornful glance had been building toward a breaking point. And as I drove home that evening, passing Karen's Tesla glinting in the fading light, I realized that the next move would define not just my home, but my entire sense of control over my life. The stage was set, the tension unbearable, and the moment of confrontation unavoidable. The question remained when the battle finally erupted, who would emerge victorious? And more importantly, what would it take to finally move that Tesla and the neighborhood's perception of power? Once and for all, the morning of the confrontation dawned with an unusual stillness. Even the birds seemed hesitant to chirp, as if aware that something monumental was about to unfold. I parked my car a few houses down, leaving the driveway free for the Tesla, letting the symbol of Karen's arrogance sit untouched, gleaming under the sun. My hands trembled slightly, a mix of adrenaline and fear, but the resolve that had been building over weeks, months even, was unshakable. As I approached, Karen appeared on her porch, eyes narrowing the moment she saw me. She didn't speak, didn't move, but her presence was a challenge in itself. For weeks she had orchestrated this neighborhood theater, making every minor rule, every petty infraction, feel like a personal attack. And now I was ready to turn the stage around. I had spent nights strategizing, planning every step, documenting every HOA letter, every inspection, every fine that had piled up in my mailbox like a mountain of absurdity. I knew the rules inside and out, the legal loopholes, the timing, the boundaries of their authority. Today, that knowledge would be my weapon. The first step was subtle. I began arranging materials, seemingly mundane logs and planks across the driveway. Neighbors peered from windows, whispers spreading like wildfire. Some frowned, some chuckled, all curious. Karen's gaze followed each movement, a flicker of concern betraying her confidence. She thought I was fumbling, underestimating my resolve. By mid-morning, the driveway had become a bizarre yet deliberate obstacle course of 40 tons of timber stacked with precision, each log positioned to demonstrate careful calculation, to transform what looked like chaos into strategy. It wasn't just about the Tesla, it was about reclaiming control. About showing that the petty rules, the intimidation, and the constant scrutiny could be countered with ingenuity, patience, and audacity. Then came the first challenge. Karen approached, her posture stiff, eyes blazing. She demanded I remove the timber immediately, citing violation after violation of some imagined rule about driveway obstruction. I remained calm, pointing to the documentation I had prepared, prior approvals, legal precedents, and citations that exposed the absurdity of the highway's overreach. The tension crackled in the air, neighbors gathering, sensing that this was the moment everything would change. Her outrage grew. She shouted, threatened fines, and called for the board, but I anticipated every move. When the first OA representative arrived, expecting compliance, they were met with the same carefully documented evidence that left them speechless. Every accusation, every rule, every threat I countered with facts and careful reasoning. The power dynamic was shifting, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. As the standoff continued, Karen attempted to assert dominance by approaching the Tesla herself, hands poised as if to move it manually. That was the moment I executed the final step of my plan. Using the leverage and alignment I had engineered with the timber, I demonstrated how the car could be shifted safely, logically, without damage. It was a controlled, almost poetic motion, turning her symbol of power into a tool of revelation. The car moved not by force but by strategy, precision, and cleverness, echoed through the street. Neighbors whispered in disbelief, some smiling, some shaking their heads at the audacity of it all. Karen stood frozen, the confident smirk replaced by shock, anger, and humiliation. The Tesla, once an emblem of her superiority, now highlighted her misjudgment, her underestimation of a determined homeowner. The HOA, flustered and confronted with a tangible demonstration of both absurdity and compliance, had no immediate response. Their threats, fines, and intimidation tactics dissolved under the clarity of evidence, strategy, and careful preparation. For the first time, the rules that had been wielded like weapons were revealed as fragile constructs, easily challenged with courage and foresight. By mid-afternoon, the standoff had reached its peak. Karen retreated to her porch, watching silently as neighbors began to murmur in support, some nodding, others openly applauding the audacity. The Tesla remained in place, a silent testament to the turning of the tide. It was no longer about petty fines or surveillance. It was about reclaiming dignity, control, and the right to live without fear of arbitrary authority. As I stepped back, surveying the transformed driveway and the shifting expressions of neighbors, a powerful realization settled in. The battle wasn't just about a car, a hedge, or a mailbox. It was about asserting presence, intelligence, and resolve against forces that thrived on intimidation. For weeks, Karen had wielded fear as a weapon. Today, clarity and courage had rewritten the narrative. And yet, the story wasn't entirely over. The neighborhood had witnessed a reversal of roles, a moment of vindication, but whispers lingered. How would the HOA respond next? Would Karen plot another challenge, another dare, in some attempt to reclaim dominance? Or had the balance finally shifted, revealing the truth about power, control, and the absurdity of arbitrary rules? The climax ended not with closure, but with a question: when the stakes are absurd, the rules oppressive, and the opposition relentless, how far would one go to reclaim their life? And what lengths would it take to finally move the metaphorical Tesla that blocks their path? The air after the confrontation was heavy with a mix of disbelief, relief, and lingering tension. For days, the neighborhood felt different, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with sunshine or weather. People whispered as they walked past my house, some nodding in quiet admiration, others shaking their heads at the audacity of what had just occurred. Karen, once a figure of absolute authority in our community, had retreated into silence. The Tesla sat where it had always sat, gleaming in the sunlight, but now its gleam carried a different message. It was no longer a symbol of dominance, but a reminder that audacity, preparation, and courage could shift even the most entrenched power structures. The HOA, predictably, tried to regroup. Letters arrived again, more cautious this time, filled with procedural language rather than threats. They had realized, finally, that arbitrary enforcement could be challenged. My meticulously documented evidence of every previous fine, inspection, and letter became a shield. It made any future attempt at intimidation transparent and legally vulnerable. I had learned to navigate their convoluted rules, anticipating their every move, and in doing so, I had created a precedent, not just for myself, but for any neighbor willing to question overreach. Karen's behavior changed subtly but noticeably. She still walked the streets, polished her porch, and parked her Tesla with precision, but the aura of untouchable superiority was gone. Her smirk no longer carried the same weight. It was quieter, restrained, almost reflective. Some neighbors commented that she seemed smaller somehow, diminished not in size but in influence. People began speaking to me more freely, their eyes no longer flicking nervously toward the driveway or the mailbox. There was a shift in the collective mood. Fear had given way to cautious empowerment. In the weeks that followed, I continued to receive HOA communications, but they were now measured, procedural, lacking the sharp undertone of personal attack. I responded calmly, referencing past correspondence, documentation, and precedent. What had once felt like harassment now felt manageable, even predictable. The sense of being constantly watched, judged, and fined dissipated. I could finally walk out to my driveway without scanning the street for hidden observers, without mentally measuring every inch of hedge and lawn. Normal life, or at least a version of it I had thought lost, returned. Yet the impact extended beyond my personal experience. Neighbors began speaking up more openly, challenging minor fines, questioning obscure rules, and documenting interactions with the HOA. I watched as a subtle revolution unfolded. A community that had once been subdued by arbitrary power and fear now began asserting its rights. The small acts of courage that I had undertaken, meticulous documentation, public demonstration of absurdity, and calm defiance, became a template for others. The balance of power had shifted not with aggression, but with careful strategy and persistence. Even Karen, despite her diminished influence, remained a fixture of the street. She was no longer untouchable, but she still had pride and presence, and in a strange way, the tension between us became manageable. Mutual acknowledgement replaced hostility, a silent understanding that the rules could be contested and that ego alone could not dictate reality. It was an uneasy truce, built on respect, strategy, and the clear lesson that power unchecked was vulnerable. The Tesla itself became almost emblematic of the story, a monument to the absurdity of authority and the capacity for resistance. Friends and neighbors would comment, sometimes jokingly, about the 40 tons of timber and the audacious way I had used it to move the vehicle. But behind the humor lay a serious message: challenges imposed by others, no matter how oppressive, could be met with preparation, intelligence, and courage. It was a victory of principle over intimidation, and of ingenuity over fear. Looking back, I realized that the ordeal had taught lessons I could never have anticipated. I had learned patience, careful planning, and the power of measured defiance. I had learned that rules, no matter how rigid or arbitrary, could be challenged effectively without succumbing to rage or recklessness. I had learned the importance of documenting interactions, understanding legal and procedural frameworks, and cultivating mental resilience in the face of relentless scrutiny. Most importantly, I had learned that standing up for oneself was not a solitary act. It rippled outward, inspiring others and transforming the environment around you. The neighborhood, once a place defined by quiet compliance and subtle fear, had been irrevocably altered. There was a new dynamic in play, one that balanced respect for rules with recognition of individual agency. Petty disputes still arose, of course, and the HOA still enforced certain standards, but the unspoken understanding was that arbitrary power could be questioned. A culture of careful accountability had replaced a culture of intimidation. The subtle tyranny that had defined our streets no longer held the same sway. And yet, the story did not end neatly. Karen remained a presence, the Tesla remained a fixture, and the HOA continued its oversight. But what had changed was the narrative. I was no longer a passive participant. I had claimed agency, demonstrated that the system's absurdities could be confronted and corrected, and shown that fear was not an inevitable response to authority. Each day that passed reinforced the lesson. Empowerment was a practice, not a moment. It required vigilance, preparation, and the courage to act when the stakes seemed high. The long-term consequences were both practical and psychological. Fines that might have once accrued unchecked were now subject to scrutiny. Letters that could have intimidated me in the past were now opportunities to assert reason, clarity, and fairness. Even casual conversations with neighbors shifted. People no longer whispered about compliance with nervous energy. They spoke with awareness, with subtle confidence, and sometimes with humor at the absurdity of previous battles. The neighborhood, while still imperfect, had been infused with a sense of collective resilience. The most profound impact, however, was personal. I realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Every letter, every inspection, every whispered complaint had been a test of patience and strategy, and I had emerged not just victorious but wiser. The Tesla remained, a silent observer of triumph over arbitrary authority. Karen, the once dominant figure, had been humbled, not destroyed, but reminded that influence is fleeting without respect and reason. And the community, which had once been a stage for control and intimidation, had become a place where boundaries could be questioned, fairness could be demanded, and the absurdity of petty rules could be challenged without fear. In the end, the lesson was clear: rules matter, but principles matter more. Authority can be questioned, power can be balanced, and courage, combined with preparation and clarity, can transform even the most oppressive environment. And so, as I walked past the Tesla one final time that afternoon, reflecting on weeks of tension, fines, and confrontation, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not in having bested a neighbor or an HOA, but in having reclaimed agency, dignity, and perspective. The story of the Tesla, the timber, and the battle over petty rules became more than just a tale of neighborhood drama. It became a story about resilience, strategy, and the importance of standing up when the odds seem stacked against you. It left a lingering question, one that resonates far beyond our street when faced with absurd authority, arbitrary rules, or relentless intimidation. How far are you willing to go to assert your rights? and what clever, determined, and audacious steps might finally shift the balance in your favor.